Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And thank you for encouraging and inspiring day yesterday. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you also enjoyed the reception. Today we have an exciting program. We have 2 plenaries, but I will start with some information in reverse order. I'll start with information about the dinner. The dinner takes place at Fløyen, and you need, for those of you who have signed up for the dinner, all the information is in this badge. So you need to bring this. The ticket is there, and the ticket to the funicular, because we're taking the funicular up to Mount Fløyen, the dinner will be at Fløyen. So if you don't bring this, no dinner. We will walk to the dinner from here after the afternoon plenary. We will walk from here at 7:05, 5-ish, 7:10. Yes. And the afternoon plenary takes place at Dragefjellet, which is the big plenary hall inside the hotel. So it's not here. And that is from 5 to 7 on globalization and international tax justice, challenges and innovation for domestic revenue mobilization in developing countries. And also encourage all panel organizers to be in good time before the panels in order to connect all the computers and so on. But now, for this morning plenary, contesting reconfigured boundaries, migration and crisis, and we are very much looking forward to this session. We do the same as yesterday concerning questions. It is possible to log on to slido.com, as you can see there. And this is the login code, EADI in capital letters 2017. And it is also possible to raise questions from the audience, as we did yesterday. It is a pleasure to introduce the chairs for this session, Dr. Arnestrand from CMI and Dr. Synnøve Bendiksen from the University of Bergen. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, and most welcome to this very interesting and I think important session. And a small correction to the introduction, it's migration and development. But there is no secret that we also will go into migration and humanitarianism, as will be part of the presentations today. After Synnøve has given a brief introduction to the team, we will have 2 distinct presenters. First will be Professor Katarina Brun, who is Director of the Center for Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookings University. We had the pleasure of collaborating for a number of years, but and learned that her research interest concerns forced migration as a result of conflict, theory and practice of humanitarianism and urbanization, but with a people-centered approach. She will be followed by Professor Uma Kothari. This is a professor of migration and post-colonial studies and former director of the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. Her projects somehow current research is on visual solidarity and everyday humanitarianism. And she has published a number of articles and books. And I think we just learned that she has been working with the University of Manchester for 25 years now, so congratulations. As stated initially, we will have 2 presentations, and then you are most welcome to put in questions to us, or afterwards to put up your hand, and we will try to guide you to a final session with questions or comments to both presentations. But to frame this, will Synnøve somehow introduce us to the topic? Please, Synnøve.
Thank you, Anna. So, the so-called refugee crisis has drawn our attention to the questions of how we as society and humanitarian actors specifically can and should relate to refugees who come to Europe or who remain in the neighboring countries. Several myths about the relationship between migration and development continue to exist. Some of these myths are actively used to promote particular political positions towards migrants, refugees, and development politics. In this panel, we seek to critically examine the border linkages and processes between migration and development in different countries and at various scales, in view of the ongoing bordering processes. In doing so, the panel challenged the current narratives on migration and deconstructs myths related to the migration-development nexus. Development is a complex phenomenon, and migration is in various ways as an aspect of this. For example, migration can be a consequence of lack of economically targeted towards specific countries to curb migration. What we see today is that people are increasingly subjected to development in a migration context and then in need of humanitarian assistance, or in being acknowledged as refugees in need of protection. As a consequence, humanitarian active challenges in how to provide what kind of care, and refugees in finding a country that will accept their asylum application. What are the current possibilities and spaces for solidarity, shared responsibility, and humanitarian ethics? Norway received a large number of refugees in 2015. Many joined positive forces and welcomed them. What happens next? Is solidarity possible in everyday life, or is it something that only transpires at critical historical moments? And how can we think about solidarity, not only in relation to refugees and within various European societies, but also in relation to development? How can we think of global justice and the right to be recognized as refugees? We're very fortunate today to have with us two experts to address these and other related questions, Uma Kotari and Katrine Brun. Please join me in welcoming first Katrine Brun.
Synnøve, Arne, Erlend, thanks for the organizers for the invite, and good morning, everyone. It's been such a nice conference so far. I've learned to know new people, but there's also a lot of old friends here, and also a lot of people who have inspired me immensely. So I hope that what I'm going to do today is in some ways paying justice to what I've learned from all of you and some of the conversations that we've already had during the conference. More and more of today's crises represent non-traditional humanitarian settings where the distinctions between categories of need are unresolved, where the relation between the need for relief and development are blurred, where current humanitarian principles, guidelines and manuscripts are not always helpful for humanitarian workers present on the ground. Some of the current refugee settings receiving much media attention are emergencies where relief is urgently needed. Oops. They happen in non-traditional spaces, outside camps, in urban settings. There are other spaces in which humanitarians engage that are less distinguished by this urgency, but where nevertheless the humanitarian community plays a crucial role. These less obvious and less traditional humanitarian settings are what I will call humanitarianism's in-between spaces. The in-between spaces constitute a significant role and are becoming exemplary settings in which humanitarians work. In these in-between spaces, humanitarians continue to operate with a humanitarian logic distinguished by emergency, urgency, and out-of-the-ordinary measures that to a large degree concerns saving people's lives rather than development. The challenges humanitarian workers face are far beyond the humanitarian mandate, its ethical register, principles, laws, and guidelines. I concentrate here on long-term displacement, where needs would be closer to development, but where a development discourse and development tools are not reachable because the host state would not accept it. Talking about development for refugees would necessarily indicate a more long-term perspective, and national politics of the host government demand a continuous focus on the discourse of return or resettlement may not be acceptable in that particular situation. In these settings, such as for Syrian refugees in Jordan, for example, humanitarianism has been the only tools available, the only discourses acceptable. So in this talk, I want to explore how the current ethical register of humanitarianism can be expanded in ways that would allow a more relevant humanitarian practice, which may also perhaps help to make the distinction between relief and development irrelevant, or less relevant, perhaps. The insights are based on what humanitarian workers already do. In this way, I suggest a pragmatic approach to humanitarianism and an expanding ethics, which includes a feminist ethics of care. The insights that I present come from 20 years of researching long-term displacement, focusing mainly on the experience and practices of people displaced by conflict. But I've also conducted action research with humanitarian actors, and during the last 5 years or so, been more involved in research on humanitarian practice itself. And as I will not have time in the presentation to go into the different cases of my research, I have included images from the research that I have conducted. And some of the publications are here. So what I would like to do in this talk is first to introduce my take on humanitarianism and the humanitarian ethics, to explain a little bit some of the backgrounds for this talk. Then I would like to say a little bit about how humanitarianism has broadened and widened through an emphasis on rights, justice, and development, before I move into a discussion of ethics of care to introduce a more relational humanitarianism. And finally, I would want to suggest how humanitarianism in a different key could happen if we involved and engaged more actively with an ethics of care. So the humanitarian system I consider here is the actors that are linked together in some functional way across multiple scales to constitute what may be termed the local global humanitarian architecture. It's a set of institutions, a business, an industry that employs hundreds of thousands of individuals in which actors compete for market share. The humanitarian system, as it is discussed here, is predominantly a Western system based on universal Western ideas and the linkages between the processes of economic and social globalization. It's a system that has become an integral part of global governance. There are many more institutions and actors that provide humanitarian assistance than these included in the humanitarian system, but internationally, the humanitarian system has gained dominance to create this humanitarian Western discourse. Typically, local actors, Islamic and Chinese organizations, and transnational groups are very often excluded from this humanitarianism that I'm using as a starting point here. Humanitarianism is governed by humanitarian reason, which Didier Fassin defines as the principle under which moral sentiments enter the political sphere. Humanitarianism is both rational and emotional. It consists of both universal principles and the effect of feeling concerned with the situation of others through the universal principle of saving strangers. Main trends in the humanitarian system over the recent years is that of professionalization, which has led to increasing universalizing ideas. More institutionalization and standardization has taken place with the consequence of more and more distance from the field and from the people that the system was established to assist in the first place. This is what the recent report on the future of humanitarianism has termed declining fieldcraft among mainstream humanitarian agencies. Although there are gradual changes in how local organizations, actors, and practices are included in the humanitarian system, there is still a predominance of a system based on universalism. Also, although there are a multitude of ways in which the humanitarian principles are being applied and interpreted, the humanitarian principles are still constituting a main identity marker for humanitarian agencies. So the most dominant stance on humanitarian practice today is to take a so-called principled approach, where the humanitarian principles are guiding the work and decision-making of an organization, often more so at head office level than on the ground. Here the ethical principles are formulated for all international Red Cross and Red Crescent movements, and then been very much adopted by a number of other organizations in various ways. The first 4 of these principles are humanity. Human suffering must be addressed wherever it is found. Neutrality, which is about not taking sides. Impartiality, which is about providing assistance based on needs and without discrimination based on characteristics such as religion and ethnicity. And independence, possessing autonomy of action. The principles have become a common vocabulary for the people working in the system, and is often the main justification for the presence of humanitarian actors in a conflict setting. Still, the principles are open for interpretation and have been subject to much criticism. It's also, I think, a very important aspect that what I call the humanitarian workers, the staff employed in the humanitarian system, may struggle to conform to the principles and do not always blindly accept the principles of the system of which they are part. A recent evaluation of an ECHO-funded humanitarian agencies in Iraq also shows how the principles are used both to justify intervention and to justify not to intervene in the exact same context. Additionally, as Thea Hillhorst, who is here, and Bram Jansen have shown, the principles are used on the ground when they are useful, but humanitarian workers rely on legal instruments and other professional guidelines when that's more useful. But instead of directly dwelling with the criticisms of the principles, what I would like to do here is to focus on the ways in which the principles and humanitarianism have been placed in particular normative ethical schools of thought, and how the principles can be negotiated through expanding that ethical register. So the principles and humanitarianism's ethics are often discussed in the context of 3 sets of normative ethical stances. The first is the Kantian or the deontological ethics, where the rightness or wrongness of actions depends on whether they fulfill our duty. We have to help. Virtue ethics, where an individual's character is the element of ethical thinking, and consequentialist ethics, where the consequences of one's conduct, which are the ultimate basis for any judgment about what we do. All these stances concentrate their attention on the rational decision of agents assumed to be independent, autonomous individuals. It also is about universal personhood, in which we assume that humanity is a shared feature across the globe, and thus that we can assume that we know the needs and desires of the other, of the stranger that we are supposed to assist. I would like to emphasize 2 blind spots in particular that need to be identified in this current ethical register. The first blind spot concerns justice and fairness, and in consequence the inclusion of rights, which have given rise to a consistent criticism of humanitarian action as being politically naive and irresponsible. Second is the relational perspective, in which a person is seen as interdependent. This blind spot makes it difficult to include the face-to-face encounters and the relational experiences of being a humanitarian worker. In this context, and with the current ethical register, it is challenging to open up what Hugo Slim terms the intimate ethics of humanitarianism. But as Bertil Tungodden showed yesterday, when we introduce social relations, it hugely influences the moral decisions that people take. So I would like to suggest that humanitarianism can open up for a different notion of the person, which is less based in universalism and individualism, without moving away from its current mandates, and at the same time responding to some of the blind spots. So my suggestion would be to expand the ethical register through an ethics of care, to include a relational perspective of what we could term an interdependent humanitarianism. So there many ways of discussing the current humanitarian system, its history, shifts and challenges. And in relation to the discussion of ethics and long-term displacement, I would like to emphasize two features and shifts. The first is what could be termed Humanitarianism 2.0. Maybe this is old-fashioned language, but I'm probably old-fashioned in that sense. And Humanitarianism 2.0 derives from a critique of the humanitarian principles. Here there is a particular emphasis on rights, justice, and the impossibility of neutrality in the context of humanitarian intervention. This has been a very important shift that to a large degree happened with the end of the Cold War and after the genocide in Rwanda. And although the humanitarian principles are in many ways seen in stark contrast to a rights-based approach, rights and laws are very much part of the humanitarian instrument, but has also led to expand humanitarianism. Another way in which this broadening has taken place is with the unilateral adaptation of displacement categories, for example. I have worked a lot on the introduction of the internally displaced person as a category in the early 1990s, which is a really important case in point which helps to target particular groups of need rather than complete impartiality. And finally, within this discussion, there is also the connection to governance, which within the context of migration has led to a critique of the dealing with refugees in general, where we see a conflation between humanitarianism and the containment of migrants, using humanitarian instruments in the governance of particular groups of people. So the next shift could be called Humanitarianism 2.1. It's still the 2, not 3.0, for example, because it's not changing radically. And it's largely following old debates. The shift can be seen in relation to the discussion around the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016 and the Global Compact for Migrants and Refugees in New York the same year. And the background to the current discussion is that humanitarian financing gaps continue to rise. Only 55% of the total funding requirement that OCHA estimated in 2016 was provided by donors, for example. Aims identified within this shift concerns efforts to shrink the needs and create the shared responsibility, deepen and broaden the resource base for humanitarian action, and improve efficiency. The grand bargain, which is a very uncomfortable term, whose bargain is it really, aims to make 25% of the humanitarian funding go to local and national actors. This is a process termed localization. The grand bargain adopts more of the language of development and opens up for a development discourse and for relating humanitarianism to the sustainable development goals. Of the 10 work streams identified in the grand bargain, 3 of them are localization, participation revolution, and strengthening engagement between humanitarian development actors. We can really see how the development language is entering into the humanitarian discourse. Many humanitarian actors have been concerned with the ways in which the grand bargain will challenge the ethical principles when national actors become more involved in controlling the funding. How can we maintain neutrality, independence, and impartiality in that context, they ask. While the inclusion of development language is nothing new, the way it has come up now reflects the needs in humanitarianism's in-between spaces. I would like to propose that an ethics of care may be helpful in contributing to make this happen. We could embrace the growing diversity where the action is defined through practice with specific pragmatic and principle adaptation in particular contexts. So let me talk a bit more about that context. 26 years. 26 years was the average duration of the 32 protracted refugee situations that UNHCR identified in 2015. So if you're in a protracted refugee situation, you might be likely to be in that situation for many, many years. Achieving a so-called durable solution of local integration, resettlement to a third country of return, seemed to be out of the reach for the majority of refugees in protracted refugee situations. At the same time, the normative frameworks, such as the 1951 Refugee Convention, is increasingly becoming irrelevant and hampering access to rights that refugees have. However, in such protracted displacement situations, a humanitarian reason based on short-term relief still largely stays unchanged. In some cases, the reason is used as a justification for the long-term presence of humanitarian agencies. And as I mentioned earlier, arguing for a rights-based approach or for including refugees into development is not acceptable at the national level. We have seen this very prominent in the context of Lebanon and Jordan, for example. So in this context, both refugees and the humanitarian workers feel stuck. Refugees and displaced persons feel that they live in a permanent impermanence, where the agency that they have mobilized in order to reach the place of displacement is largely curtailed. They cannot reach the future they dream of. They cannot develop the lives they want. It's a situation of waiting, and despite the agency people are able to mobilize in waiting, the possibilities for development and reaching a desired future are marginal. So in a series of interviews with humanitarian workers, we found that humanitarian workers also often feel stuck in this situation. They want to know more about how to do humanitarianism when their operation becomes more long-term and when they have learned to know the environment and the people they work with better. In a way, these are unintended consequences of a humanitarian approach. People being stuck in limbo, not being able to develop their lives, and an emergency approach that extends for more than 20 years, for example. But it seems very difficult to get out of this. So a most productive approach, an entry point to expand the ethical register for humanitarianism is to focus more on what people do, both the refugees and the humanitarian workers. By focusing on what people do, I argue for a pragmatic approach. Pragmatism is often used as a term of abuse in humanitarianism. It signifies an unprincipled approach in opposition to the principled approach. It is an approach that has justified military intervention in the name of humanitarianism, for example. But I would rather suggest an approach that moves back to the pragmatic philosophies, that place practice and doing as the starting point for how we understand the world, where meaning and conceptions to be sought in their practical bearings. There is an emergent body of work in humanitarianism that emphasizes the everyday practices of humanitarianism, and I've been very much inspired by the work of Lisa Malky, her recent work, by Ilana Feldman, and by Thea Hilhorst's work on everyday practices of humanitarian workers. And Ilana Feldman has termed this ethical labor, processes that incorporates ethical reflection on the actual humanitarian work, care for others as much as the care for self, in the context of working with refugees. This care of the self is not simply an internal practice as work for self-reflection and correction, but it's also about ways of interacting with other people. We could do a lot of discussion about pragmatism and the different ethics behind the principles, but I don't have time to go into that philosophy. But what I would rather like to do is to move into try to explain what feminist ethics of care can do for humanitarianism in this particular context. And reflections on ethics of care have been more prominent in development studies than in humanitarianism, but not very prominent in any of them. In fact, in humanitarianism, care ethics have been largely dismissed or avoided. Perhaps because it is seen to be in opposition to the dominant humanitarian principles whose ethics derive from an individualist and universalist origin. Care ethics could help to deal with the relationship between rights and care and similarly create meeting points between humanitarianism and development. My starting point is that ethics of care is much closer to what humanitarian workers do in the field than the traditional humanitarian principles. I use a definition of care from Engster here, which says caring may be said to include everything we do directly to help others to meet their basic needs, develop or sustain their basic capabilities, and alleviate or avoid pain or suffering in an attentive, responsive, and respectful manner. And I'll try my very best to explain a bit more about what is in the care ethics domain, and I hope I can do this in a sensible way. A feminist ethics of care was first introduced by Carol Gilligan in 1982, but has later been adopted by a number of scholars. Care ethics are concerned with caring about rather than caring for, but Tronto explained care in 4 phases. Caring about is about the recognition that care is necessary, identifying a need. It involves cultural and social approaches to care. Caring for, or taking care of, assuming some responsibility for that need, involves notions of agency and responsibility in the caring process. Caregiving is the direct meeting of needs for care. This is where humanitarian practice is located. It involves physical work and almost always requires that caregivers come in contact with the subjects of care. And care receiving recognizes that the subject of care will respond to the care it receives. Care as ethics is developed through care as practice, and it is difficult to separate the two. In an ethics of care, there is the acknowledgement of a much more active, conscious, but also challenging relationship between the humanitarian worker and the ones she is there to assist. So practice would be the first principle in an ethics of care for humanitarianism. Care is embedded in practice, and it opens up for emotions and affect that are involved in the experience of care. This makes it distinctive from other ethical theories, such as those mentioned earlier, which is calibrated through rational discussions that constitute ethics. In my interview with humanitarian workers in Jordan, I often heard, "We just had to do something." Despite the restrictions they met, humanitarian workers tried to do as much as possible for the people with whom they worked. They stretched the humanitarian space as much as they could within the restrictions that they felt. The next on my list of principles for ethics of care is interdependent. An ethics of care usually works with the conception of persons as relational rather than as the self-sufficient, independent individual of the dominant moral theories. The universality of care ethics can be found here. Every person starts out as a child, dependent on those providing us care, and we remain interdependent with others in a thoroughly fundamental way throughout our lives. We can think and act as independent only through a network of social relations that make it possible for us to do so. In our research on knowledge gaps, we found that humanitarian workers felt the need to have better tools and ways of understanding their position in the field relative to all other actors. Ethics of care opens up for a more nuanced understanding of those relations and of ways of unpacking the power relations involved in a caring relationship, including acknowledging the always unequal power relations. Then I move to context or contextualization. And humanity in the context of more universalist ethics is defined as sameness between us and the stranger. A main argument in campaigns for support to development and humanitarian organizations is to understand the other as just like us so that we can generate sympathy and willingness to assist, give and support. But we must not assume that we know what the other needs and wants and prioritizes. A more contextualized understanding of persons and consequently of humanity is embedded in an ethics of care. Contextualization would also then enable more inclusion of local practices and open up for localization, as called for by the Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain. I have seen in my own research how a local discourse of hospitality towards displaced is replaced by a humanitarian discourse when the humanitarian agencies move in and largely displace the local hosts. Bringing in care ethics more actively into humanitarian ethics could enable more attentiveness to these localized practices of care and could potentially help to include those existing structures rather than excluding them. 2 more principles to go. My next principle is the future orientation in these in-between spaces of humanitarianism. Widely discussed in development studies and anthropology, temporality has to a lesser extent been included in humanitarian studies. With more emphasis on resilience, this might be a way of integrating the two, but I'm not touching resilience discussion here. But more importantly, humanitarianism seldom incorporates a notion of future. When we care about another, as defined in ethics of care, we acknowledge their future. Their welfare and their ethical significance are bound up with our own future. Within an ethics of care, care is always future-directed, and in the first instance, always attached to specific individuals. It's thereby specifically directed towards their biographies and their futures, and it's tied to futures which are embedded in distinct context of concern. So finally, care and rights is a very important issue that we need to somehow solve. I'm not sure I've solved it yet. But while rights are often regarded as the analytical and substantive key to achieving protection, this is a main challenge because refugees occupy this space between rights and humanity in protracted displacement situations. In such cases, a rights-based approach may not be very helpful and productive, and ethics of care problematizes this reach of rights. An ethics of care enables the focus on a particular context, the needs, claims, fears, and hopes for particular subjects. An ethics of care has concrete visions of agency and action. It then takes responsibility as its primary moral value because it argues that moral action requires recognition of responsibilities rather than more indeterminate picture of agency offered by rights-based theories. So in this way, by understanding the limits of rights and the reach of rights, an ethics of care can also politicize the act of violence that can derive from protracted displacement and the deprivation of basic needs with the resulting precarious lives. It is important that humanitarian practice is necessarily always in a compromised position. Including care ethics more actively into the ethical register of humanitarianism can help humanitarian workers to negotiate these positions. But there is more to do to develop this ethics of care in the varying spaces of humanitarianism. There's much more to problematize and to develop and engage with. And first of all, I think in the care literature that I've gone through so far, a lot of it is written in context where the relationship is described between members of the same society, where membership is often uncontested, or it is a sort of cosmopolitan ethics of care, caring at distance. This is clearly not the case for the refugees that we are considering here. What I'm more concerned with here is the role that ethics of care can play in humanitarianism's face-to-face relations. There is also a second weakness, which is that ethics of care can become what Parvati Raghuram called more emplaced. Because it is practice-based, we need to have much more research on what ethics of care may mean in particular places, particular contexts, and particular settings. Third, the role of politics and power can be much more explicitly discussed. And fourth, prioritizing between people with extreme needs, with less and less resources, also needs to be given much more attention. I still think there is a potential for engaging with ethics of care, and particularly in these in-between spaces of long-term displacement. In these in-between spaces of protracted displacement, outside institutionalized spaces, where the tension between neutral humanitarian expertise and political engagement is ever present, humanitarian actors perform what Kyoto and Landau have termed stealth humanitarianism. It's a quiet, local approach to humanitarianism, where the inclusion of refugees into the local community, social security systems, and other more formalized systems can take place based on a particular context. In yesterday's session on humanitarianism in disaster and conflict settings. This was called Backstage Humanitarianism, I think. This is an alternative to the purely principled approach. It's an alternative to a rights-based approach which could operate at the national level to advocate for general rights to inclusion, which we have seen does not work. It does not just argue for an informal approach to assist refugees, but it is a pragmatic approach that could be supported within the humanitarian reason with an ethics of care as a moral compass, and that can enable development within the humanitarian mandate. This stealth or quiet humanitarianism is taking place already, but has not been included in the dominant humanitarian discourse. Kihato and Landau show examples from several African cities. Our own work for Syrian refugees in southern Lebanon shows the same. Here, local Lebanese organizations with a long-term history of connections and insights into moving the Syrian refugees into particular service provisions in parallel with poorer hosts and not least other groups of displaced populations. An ethics of care can work as a foundation and help to expand the ethical register of humanitarianism towards a principled, pragmatic humanitarianism. It can then help to nuance the humanity and challenge and develop the other principles that we already engage with. And as I've already said, I would suggest, and this is my 5 last points, I would like to suggest that these 5 principles need to be added or expanded on in the particular way that we work with humanitarianism. Practice on how people, both refugees, humanitarians and other relevant actors, go about their day-to-day lives in a particular context, interdependency, where humanitarians need to become an active part of the local setting, building solidarities between refugees, local citizens and local authorities, context, understanding subjects and unpack the diversity of needs that may be present in that context, temporality or futurizing, where much more focus is on understanding what future peoples envisage, shaped by their existing needs and aspirations. And finally, care rather than rights must be emphasized to develop an approach that can make local acceptance for refugees to be included into formal systems for development to take place in displacement. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Katrine. I think we just move straight on to Uma. And a reminder that if you'd like to pose questions, we will have a session afterwards where we go into the different questions to the 2 sessions. Please.
Thank you. I've planted my own sound checker in the audience, so Emma, thank you. First of all, thank you. First of all, I'm immensely grateful to the organisers for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's my first EADI conference, and it certainly won't be my last. I'm currently based at the University of Melbourne because I'm on a research sabbatical after spending 3 years as director of the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. And of course, after those 3 years as being director, I had lots of sort of plans about the writing and the research that I was going to do on my sabbatical. But my plans changed because I got absolutely obsessed in telling a different story. Because just before I left to go to Melbourne, I was going through my father's things, clearing out his house in India. And I came across this old briefcase. It was locked with no key, but of course in India, as in many other places, that doesn't make a difference. You can always find somebody who will not ask any questions and open it for you. And inside were 6 photographs. There's 4 of them that I've put up here. My mother with her first camera, my parents in their first flat in London in the 1960s, my father at some sort of business lunch, and at the top right, my parents on holiday somewhere. And alongside those 4 photographs were 2 exercise books, old Indian school exercise books. And in the front pages on the left-hand side here was a travelogue which detailed dates, places left and arrived at, the amount of petrol in the tank, the date and the time. And in the back pages on the right here were their accounts. And as it transpired, In 1955, my parents took the steamer from Bombay to Southampton, travelled up to London, bought a Morris Oxford car, and spent the next 6 months travelling back to India. They first drove through Britain, visiting iconic sites that had fueled their imagination during their education under British colonial rule in India. They went to Stratford-upon-Avon, where they paid 9 shillings to see Macbeth at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, because, of course, they pored over the Longman poetry reader when they were at school. Now, they were anti-colonial nationalists, but they dreamt of visiting Britain, the ambivalence, of course, of colonialism. So as I embarked on my first attempt to try and make scholarly what had for a long time just been an extraordinary family story, I began to bring together 2 academic fields of study that have preoccupied my own work over the last 30 years in development: the study of migration, the movement of people and mobility, and the history and the legacy of colonialism in the present. And I became aware that actually my parents' story was one of post-colonial networks. It was a form of post-colonial solidarity, which I hope that I have time at the end to give an example of, drawn from their accounts. And I reflected, in a sense, on how development discourse, thinking, policy, and practice has embedded particular spatial, historical, moral, ideological, political demarcations in such a way that it's constrained the forging of solidarity. And I want to think about this in the context of refugees and refuginess, and specifically to examine it in the context of where is the theorizing around solidarity, where is the practice of solidarity within Western studies of development, because surely that is foundational to what development is about. And I think this requires a much more effective endeavour to forge practices of care for others based on mutual recognition and shared responsibility rather than the magnanimous gestures towards distant others. And I think part of the problem here is that there remains a taken for granted assumption that development interventions exemplify solidarity, because after all, development interventions, aren't they founded on ideas about universal rights and an ethics of care? However, the persistence, I think, of dominant narratives that homogenize and dehumanize refugees reveal the inadequacy of development thinking to understand and to challenge these representations and to instill some kind of solidaristic principle. Because solidarity can't be merely invoked or forged at distinct critical moments, but rather emerge over time in everyday contexts and in everyday spaces, as Katharina has identified. In this context, then, how might development promote and sustain new forms of solidarity that work towards achieving global social justice? So what I want to do is to start off by looking at that process of dehumanization and then look at some of the constraints within development for how we find ourselves limited in forging solidaristic principles and ways of moving towards that kind of everyday humanitarianism, and then look at some of the ways forward. And if I have time, I'd like to return to my parents' story to look at a form of post-colonial solidarity. Yesterday afternoon, Katrina and I received an email saying we had to cut our talk down by 5 minutes. So I've adopted a 2-pronged strategy. I have taken out a few paragraphs, and now I'm going to speak very, very quickly. In 1968, Hannah Arendt wrote that we should retain the aspiration to strive for a world in common. She argues that during World War II, refugees were seen as superfluous people. So what did she mean by that? Well, she meant that mobile people had no state and no citizenship rights, right? But they also had no visibility. That is, that they couldn't appear to act or speak in public. They had no agency or agentive presence. So they were removed from the public and political sphere, and all they had was their biological lives, right? Their bodies, that they could live or die. Ultimately, she wrote, we can see that they are human, but they're not humanized. And today, as we witness the humanitarian catastrophe of our generation, how have we come to be just so inhumane all over again? And while many of us here thoroughly reject how those fleeing persecution and violence are being constituted in politicized discourses and the way in which they're being publicly represented, nonetheless, our perceptions and understandings continue to be shaped by or indeed are in reaction to, a public discourse that dehumanizes but also distances the other. As Silverstone notes, distance is not just a material, a geographical, or even a social category, it's a moral category. Because in the media, we sometimes push others to a point beyond strangeness, beyond humanity, where they become dehumanized and demonized. So over the last few decades, we've effectively normalized the previously unacceptable through the construction of a notion of refugeeness that sits within complex discursive ideas of security and threat, compassion and hospitality, with refugees predominantly framed as either helpless victims or objects of fear. And this seriously affects how refugees are publicly perceived, the ways in which they're received, and the ways in which they're welcomed. And people rely very heavily on media accounts for their knowledge beliefs, for their knowledge, their beliefs and opinions. And all of that, I think, hinders the possibility of a sort of form of transnational solidarity. So 2015 was indeed the year of the most highly publicized and mediatized representations of refugees and the movement of people. So the dehumanizing that Arendt talked about is placed in an ever more extensive and immediate medium. And this works to generate powerful and often negative connotations that vilify refugees, instill fear and hatred, but simultaneously have led to the outpouring of compassion and acts of kindness that we've witnessed. Now, in times of social and political upheaval, cultural shifts and economic instability, solidarity was defined in a sense as the willingness to share and redistribute material and immaterial resources, drawing on feelings of shared fate and vision, group loyalty, and collective action. And one of the most profound and widespread developments in the context of refugees today has been a visual language of welcome. Although it might be easier, of course, to welcome others than to live amongst them. But perhaps there's a potential for the welcome to be political and for welcoming to have multiple, unintended, long-lasting, even generational effects. And we begin to get different kinds of accounts, different kinds of representations from artists and poets. And here we have Banksy's The Floating Corpses that resonates with the European flag, and a poem by Wasan Shai trying to respond to the ways in which people have argued that, why are you getting in a boat when you know that you're likely to drown, an overcrowded boat when you're likely to drown? And she says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So Judith Butler says that perhaps what we need to think about is we need an innovative conceptualization of solidarity that's based on the notion of shared embodied experience. And in Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly in 2015, she argues that the very fact of people gathering says something without always relying on speech. Protesters, she says, make manifest the understanding that a situation is shared. Now, of course, in development, when you may not have the shared embodied experience, because we're talking about perhaps distant strangers and people who are geographically removed, we need to think about other forms of solidarity. So how is this shaping our own discipline? Edward Said says, as academics, we have an important role to play. Underlying every interpretation of other cultures is the choice facing the individual scholar or intellectual, whether to put intellect at the service of power or at the service of criticism, communities, and moral sense. We in development studies, I think, are positioned at a very critical moment, one that's replete with potential to shape the future through new forms of solidarity and to nurture everyday humanitarianism, to be political. And this is increasingly important, as Ticktin argues, in a world where borders of the global north are zealously guarded and inequality between the north and south is growing. Immigrants and refugees become some of the key populations served by humanitarians, and Katrina has explained that very well, I think. Perhaps you might say, but development is, of course, inherently solidaristic. Key elements of development theory and practice and the mission of international NGOs, such as ideas about universal rights, are structured around ideals and principles that are replete with notions of humanitarianism and with ideas around solidarity. But there is, in fact, a taken for granted, I think, humanitarianism that's assumed in our North-South connections and our ethos of care for distant strangers, our global institutions and our experts, our proclaimed commitments to universal justice and rights. Surely then we are already solidaristic, we are already humanitarian. But remember, colonialism was itself justified through tales of universalism and in defense of humanism. And this is taken from the Empire Marketing Board posters, the colonial government's posters from 1926 to 1933. And here is an early representation, in fact, of that kind of supposed humanism and the superiority of certain groups of people who are justified in intervening in the lives of others. Well, no, I don't think that development is inherently solidaristic, and I don't think that we should carry on assuming that it is necessarily humanitarian. I think solidarity is limited and constrained in development for 5 key reasons. First of all, there's been an increase in academic research on refugees and humanitarianism, but much research continues to invoke and reproduce colonial imaginaries. Here we have a French colonial Christmas card, which was sent written on the body is your colonized identity. We have made many advances in our thinking about development, partly due to post-colonial and feminist critiques, but one area I think that continues to bedevil our attempts at achieving social justice is the continuing racialization of humanitarian ideas and practices that mean that we're unable to see others as our contemporaries. Fundamentally, they are just too different. Secondly, there's an iconography of famine, of poverty. Foundational to mainstream development, I think, is the need to reaffirm difference and distance for all our arguments for bringing people closer together and a common humanity. I think development is actually founded on reinforcing dualisms and dichotomies because it's that justifies the intervention of some people into the lives of others. And so we embed those dualisms between rich and poor, donors and beneficiaries, West and the rest, us and them. And there's the inherent power then of the development industry to translate and represent other people in a very narrow repertoire of tropes. And we all use this language. This isn't a critique of any individual, but I've heard it in the conference today. I read about it in development journals. People talk about locals or indigenous knowledge. And what that does is reify people as embedded in place, and it abstracts them from the global. So the expert has global knowledge, but the local always only has indigenous knowledge. And by doing that, we reify that distinction and that dichotomy. Through new discourses of partnerships and co-production of knowledge that we see in the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, we are, in a sense, creating perhaps a facade of commonality by using the terms partnership and co-production of knowledge. And I could say a lot more about that, but I don't have time. There's also been a tendency to homogenize the other, to label, for example, everyone who moves under certain conditions. Immediately they move, they become refugees. And as Peter Gatrell writes, we discard as unimportant the life they lived hitherto. Thirdly, there's an emergence of neoliberal forms of solidarity. In The Ironic Spectator, Solidarity in the Age of Post-Humanitarianism, Lily Churiaki provides a very convincing argument for international development scholars to consider how important communication is. She mounts a critique of 3 transformations that have brought about pragmatism, privatism, and self-gratification. A public discourse of solidarity, she argues, has shifted towards cool capitalism and a neoliberal conception of humanitarianism that replaces conviction with consumption. There you have Bono advertising Louis Vuitton in a sort of stereotypical African savannah. Fourthly, the policy and impact-driven research. These are, to remind you, I'm on the fourth of explaining why I think that we are constrained in development in forging some kind of solidarity. This is George Osborne, who was the Chancellor, the Exchequer under Cameron, and now editor of the London Evening Standard. To me, that says it all. So it's not new to remark on the policy and impact-driven research, but I think it's a useful reminder that aid and development has become instrumentalized. And the changing nature of academia, especially in development where we chase funding, policy implications, end users. I've always wondered, what is an end user? You know, where does it stop? And impact are constraining us. And the Sustainable Development Goals, even though I don't want to be overcritical about them, but they shift our gaze in a way, and prevent us, in a sense, from, as Churiaki says, that the scholarly field of development studies produces administrative policy rather than critical political theory. And fifthly, the new actors and agents. Already in 1995, in his excellent book, The Power of Development, Jonathan Crush noted how the development machine had not only expanded at a phenomenal rate since the 1940s, but alongside that, the discipline had become politically diverse, with liberal and conservative strands constituting conflicting intellectual currents. There is now, of course, a whole range of new and different development actors involved in a variety of ways in the industry. And in development studies, I think we need to consider this very seriously. Increasingly important, of course, is the general Western public. Consumers through fair trade, for example, those who give to charity, attend musical events, those who are involved in producing and circulating the plethora of public media and consumer campaigns. So development is actually in the everyday, in the mundane. It's truly all-encompassing. Where does development begin? Where does it end? So what does this mean then for development studies? Well, I suggest, and perhaps not surprising to some of you, that we need to re-engage with post-colonial critiques. Post-colonialism challenged the power of development to crudely ascribe particular characteristics to different societies, and has attempted to resist the variety of ways in which the West produces knowledge about other people and places. But that's not enough. I think we need to move beyond post-colonial critique to actually thinking what we might move into, what space might we create. And there are three areas where I think this might be possible. The first is rethinking the spatial and geographical in development studies. The second is to rethink the temporal and historical. And the third is the ideological and political demarcations of development. And just a few notes on each of those. In terms of the spatial and the geographical, many people have argued that the old north-south divide that historically enabled the existence of the discipline is outdated. It doesn't reflect today's multipolar world. Large-scale transnational movements, detention, resettlement of people fleeing violence and persecution emphasizes, in a sense, this shift. And this complicates the idea of what we mean by proximate and distant in terms of solidarity, at least spatially. So has solidarity changed because the people over there are now here? Well, of course, the people over there have always, in a sense, been here. So the question is, will a new geography of development open up possibilities for new forms of solidarity to emerge? And I think that's something that we could consider in development studies. Secondly, temporal, the significance of history. New geographies have to be accompanied by new histories. The future orientation of development closes off certain options to deal with the past and past injustices. We're always obsessed with targets and goals and the future orientation. And open any development textbook and it starts with Truman's speech or in 1945. And what that does is conceal a colonial genealogy of development. Tronto argues that conceiving of the past as irrelevant has devastating consequences for our concerns for justice. I don't think we should be historically deterministic, but I think that forgetting past injustices may be used as a way of invoking contemporary agency. But the structures and limitations of the past continue to shape that agency. It leaves no room for remedying past injustices or for moving towards a responsible accountability. And Nina Glick-Schiller writes that historical reflexivity has become curiously lost in recent writings about migration. I think history can help us find and create new possibilities of solidarity. And thirdly, the ideological. And I want to focus on a little bit on care. And I also draw on Parvati Raghuram's article that Katrina mentioned. But Barnett and Land suggests that responsibility and care are useful notions for invigorating and shaping political practice. Post-colonial thinking that centers from that, post-colonial thinking challenges the centers from which that care and responsibility can be talked about. What does care look like for different people from different centers? So drawing on humanism, the contours of care are often presumed and defined by ethical values which masquerade as universal. But post-colonial analysis raises questions surrounding the responsibilities that people in different parts of the world bear to each other and their ability and desire to care for one another. So the concept and practice of solidarity has become ever more elusive in development. Even though there have been demonstrations of solidarity through a host of convivial practices, the refugee crisis has revealed a deep crisis of solidarity. Solidarity is likely to be found amid the mundane rhythms of daily life rather than the mission statement of a global charity. We now need to embed solidaristic discourses and practices as foundational and fundamental to development studies. It's what should make us distinguishable as a field of study. After 3 months of driving through Europe, Shanti and Tara, my parents, decided to see the renowned sights of Egypt. On the 17th of September, 1955, they arrived at Alexandria, Egypt, walking down the gangway of a Lloyd Tristino passenger ship that they'd boarded in Naples. After traveling to Cairo, they drove to Port Said, a distance of about 200 kilometers, to board a cargo ship heading down the Suez Canal to Aden, to Yemen. Always curious, they often diverted off roads, and in this instance, they broke their journey. My partner and I are going to follow the logbook next summer, and we feel it's going to take us even longer because we're going to be diverted off as they were all the time. Always curious, they diverted off, and this time they broke their journey 120 kilometers from Cairo to visit the city of Ismailia, situated on the west bank of the Suez Canal, a city established in 1869 to house the European engineers and laborers who operated the Suez Canal when it was first developed. On the outskirts of Ismailia, they lost their way, and suddenly in front of them, a roadblock appeared, and armed men, Egyptian soldiers, commanded that they slow down and stop. The soldiers brandished their guns as they surrounded the vehicle, and with terse instructions demanded that they wind down the windows of their Morris Oxford car. They had entered a militarized zone adjacent to the Suez Canal. Tensions in Egypt had already begun with President Nasser's impending decision to nationalize the canal and thereby control access and accrue revenues for ships passing through the vital waterway, which would eventuate in the notorious Suez Crisis, culminating in the invasion of Egypt by Israeli forces and subsequently British and French bombing campaigns. The hard expressions of the soldiers softened as it became apparent that the travelers, my parents, though their identity was still unclear, posed no danger. Nasser, Tito, Nkrumah, Nehru, or Sukarno, they inquired, reciting the names of the leaders of the then nascent non-aligned movement that had been born in the Asia-Africa Conference held in Bandung in April 1955, the year that they traveled. Upon hearing the reply, Nehru, the soldiers greeted the visitors with broad smiles, pointing and beating their chests and saying, Nasser, Nasser. Like these Egyptians, Tara and Shanti had formerly been subjects of the British Empire, and like them, they'd asserted their right to independence. Nehru, the acknowledged senior statesman, along with Nasser, led the Bandung Conference. At the meeting, Third World leaders shared their problems of resisting the pressures of the major powers, maintaining their independence, and opposing colonialism and neocolonialism, a form of post-colonial solidarity. Their Indian and, importantly, anti-colonial identity confirmed the excitement of the soldiers grew as they noticed my mother's sari. They remarked upon her likeness to the Indian actress Nadira, who played a starring role in the 1952 Bollywood movie Aan, And after a short burst of excitable chatter, they broke out into a hearty rendition of the song Main Rani Hun Raja Ki. Their upright bearing transformed as their boot-clad feet shifted in accompanying approximations of dance moves from the film. Shanti and Tara joined the singing. They had seen the film in India when it was first released and were very familiar with the soundtrack. And Anne had been enormously popular in Egypt and had been watched by millions. After this musical interlude, the soldiers laid down their guns and warned them about the safest route to take to avoid the escalating tensions. In the post-war, post-independent spaces across which Tara and Shanti were moving, new, distinctly post-colonial networks and solidarities were emerging. Their mobile encounters in Egypt catalyzed connections that were emerging prior to their arrival and were reproduced by them. They were made resonant by the shared historical context in which India and Egypt had both been subject to British colonial rule and the independent struggles that successfully eventuated in independent nationhood. They shared a subaltern positionality that they were in the process of transcending. They'd entered a space that was being encompassed by new political and cultural networks and in which they played a role and found a sense of solidarity. One that we need to reinvigorate, especially in this time of dehumanizing those who are fleeing violence and persecution. And the legacy continues. And that's the Empire Marketing Board Commonwealth poster. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Omar. Can we ask Katrina to come up here as well? I think we just move this over there.
Ah, okay. Huh. I feel I should have a glass of wine.
Thanks a lot for two excellent presentations that really took us from the code of ethics that you presented, that I think is excellent, but we need to discuss more, and then really questioning both development, our role as academics in it all, but the whole notion of solidarity. We've had some questions coming in, but I'd also like to allow if there is anyone in the audience that like to put their hands up, please do that. I think, Suneva, do you have some of the questions that you'd like to start with?
Yes,
for the
I can
panelists?
start with one of the questions here. So, an anonymous writer is asking, in a situation on unequal relations, what keeps ethics of care from being reduced to paternalism, which in turn reduces people to beneficiaries and not agents? So because of the unequal, how I understand it, because there's an unequal relationship as the context of the situation, how is it possible to avoid that ethics of care becomes paternalistic and then reducing people to be beneficiaries of care?
I think what the potential, maybe I'm not able to answer fully that question in a short space, but I think what is really exciting and productive with ethics of care is that it actually problematizes that relationship and it opens up for ways that humanitarians could problematize and be more attentive to that relationship in their day-to-day work. It doesn't necessarily solve everything, but hopefully by having that as a tool, it is possible as well to enter into that unequal relation in a different way. So I think that's my starting point, really.
One question which has gotten 2 votes, so more interested in that, is about the language, how we're using the language. So the language we use is important in humanizing others. Why do we use dichotomous language which lumps diverse groups together, such as the global North and South?
Good question. Why do we? We shouldn't be. But I mean, I think I mean, yesterday there was presentations around the group and how the ways in which groups form, and I suppose that we are members of multiple groups ourselves, and we position ourselves as collectives in different ways that are temporal and spatial and change over time. But the problem within development is that there's this sort of external mapping between sort of colonized and colonizer. I'm not very keen on the terms global north and global south. I've always preferred, I'm sort of on a one-woman mission to keep first world and third world, because I think it reinvigorates the politics that's embedded in that relationship, even though it's another dualism. So yes, I mean, I think that language is very problematic, and that I don't think that we don't actually need to use it. We don't need to use that language, and we've got a lot of debate in the refugee literature, in newspapers now. Al Jazeera and the BBC always have a footnote at the bottom saying what we mean by refugees is, or they actually just use a longer term, somebody who has left Syria because of this. And so, yeah, I think that we need to unpack that language, because embedded in it is those unequal power relations.
Yeah. Do you want to add something, Catherine?
No, I agree.
You also feel free to, yes, raise your hands. We have mics.
Can you start by introducing yourself, please? It works.
Yeah, all right. Raymond Sana from the Center for Socioeconomic Development in Geneva. I'd like to thank both presenters for very moving, thoughtful, and future-pacing presentations. Future pacing, I'd like to hear from the two of you, what are your expectations and maybe also concerns about the two global compacts that are being negotiated? As you know, one on refugees by the United Nations member countries, one on refugees and the other one on migrants. How much would that impact both fields, development and humanitarianism? Thanks.
I mean, I'll just very quickly, I'm sure you've got more to say about that, but just very quickly for me is that I think that it's important that we have some kind of collective action, and that's what I feel solidarity is about. I don't know whether they necessarily emerge out of policy and compacts. But for me, one of the issues that I'm really keen for us to look at in more detail is not necessarily just refugees, but the notion of refugee-ness. And I think that's absent in a lot of those debates, is the ways in which refugee-ness has become a discursive and highly politicized term that brings together all kinds of issues that in themselves are problematic. So what I would suggest is that, talking about compacts around refugees and migrants, that we need to think much more carefully about migrancy and refugee-ness and what they mean, and I think that will help us move forward.
No, I would just like to add to that. I think one of the challenges is that a lot of it is taking place within the same discourse as before. And as we have seen very clearly, the normative frameworks and the durable solutions are not very much reachable for a number of the people that the global compacts are discussing. And it's very difficult to connect the two in the current language that's being used and in the current sort of vocabulary that's being developed. So there is something that we need to speculate a bit outside that in a way, I think, in order to think what can be done. So I very much agree.
There's one over there, please.
Thank you. I really enjoyed both of those talks. In my question concerns the sort of with development studies re-engaging with post-colonial studies. Do we need to think? I'd like to hear your thoughts on the idea that we need to introduce into our lexicon the term reparations, and whether that might be helpful.
That's a very good question. I don't know whether I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure whether I can sort of gather my thoughts enough to respond very directly to that. But there's a wonderful novel which is called The Apologist by Jay Rayner, and he's so good at apologizing to past partners that he's done horrible things to and things that he's stolen from his mum's handbag, etc. And he becomes such an expert apologist that he becomes the chief apologist for the UN Organization of Apology. And it's an amazing story because he travels around the world cooking, gumbo in the southern states of America to apologize for slavery or going somewhere else today. And it's very interesting because it plays on that issue around reparation and apology. And what the UN Organization for Apology found out in the end is that if you say sorry, then you will have to pay less reparations than if you don't say sorry. And sorry, that's a really awful response. But I was just thinking about that book the other day because as I was thinking about solidarity. So I'm really sorry, really glib response to a very, very important question.
I can't match that. But I think one common aspect of the two talks is really about the importance to bring in biography. I mean, what humanitarianism is often about is saving biological lives, and the biography is very often forgotten. And people are not being seen as, subjects because of that in many situations. We've seen it with the ways that these massive frameworks to map vulnerability is taking place in Jordan, for example, today. And I think this is actually, collecting so much information about refugees without including their histories is really very problematic. So bringing in the past and the history, as you say, at all levels and all scales is crucial in the discussion that we are having. So, sorry, that wasn't so fun, but...
Much more intellectual.
I wonder if I should bring it more in then the practical direction as well, if I can, because we've been working on different refugee crises. What we see now, like Syria, we see continuous effort in Afghanistan, we see Yemen, we see all these countries now producing migrants for different reasons that somehow then, and partly causing the debate and the picture that you point out, is that they have come to Europe. A lot of these states are now labeled as one term, fragile states. And our response is then often to provide more development assistance, less attention actually on the humanitarian side, because it's seen as developing these states, building their own capacity to handle the crisis, and ensuring development is then implicitly what will reduce terrorism and less migration. So I have a lot of concern with this term as being adapted because one, I don't think it one size fits all. They are so diverse. There are so diverse reasons why people are leaving these countries. So how are we as academics to address this term, fragile states? How are we going to address and discuss development possibilities? How are we going to discuss how we, together with, or whatever term we use, with people in those areas define the humanitarian needs? Can you see a way where we somehow can take this challenge, which is really where academia meets politics at the moment?
I feel that one of the things that I've really noticed in the media is that we have a lot of the representations like the ones that I showed, but there's very little discussion now about why people are moving. And if you read the media, all you see is overcrowded boats and languages of swarming and, kind of like waves of migrants coming and instilling that fear. We don't really have very detailed or even just brief summaries of what the context is. And I think that's very much missing. And I think in our teaching and in our writing, we need to explain historically and politically and socially why it is that people are moving. They are not producing migrants and refugees. Nobody is producing a migrant and a refugee. People are creating contexts which are historically embedded, whereby certain groups of people need to leave because they're fleeing persecution. And I think that that's really important. I think the second thing, and I'm sure Katrina will be able to say much more about that given your research, is that most migrants are not coming to Europe. I mean, most of them are going to the 4 countries surrounding Syria. So there's also that kind of representation where it appears as though that they're all wanting to come to Europe. And actually, a lot of, and you can say more about this, but want to return to Syria or their place of origin.
Yeah, I think one of my really it's a term that I get very provoked by, is a lot of the policy language says refugees who find themselves in the particular situation. I mean, they don't find themselves in that situation. There is a way that, you know, they came into that situation. They have showed an enormous amount of mobilization of their own resources and agency to be able to be there. But there is that particular trajectory which they have had to take to be able to get there. And there's very little understanding of that. And this conflation about refugees or migrants, etc., that we see in the public media is really contributing to that. And the issue of fragile state is, of course, a way of, you know, making this even more simplified, I think. So I really agree, and it is challenging though, and I think this is really, you know, what do we do as researchers? How do we convey that message? I mean, migration researchers within development has been jumping up and down for I don't know how many years, saying that you can't just stop migration, right? But still, that is very much of the discourse that is out there. So I don't know. I think this is really. And there are some sessions here about how do we, you know, portray, how do we become part of the discourse, and how can we change it as researchers? And I think much more can be done, of course.
And one question which has been sent in from the audience, which relates to the answer that you have given, is the question of what about the role of development education in cultivating solidarity? Has that been undervalued by the development sector? And I like to add a question myself on that, and that is, I sometimes find it hard to write about solidarity, to make the distinction as an analytical notion, and using then, I'm an anthropologist, using my empirical data. So, because in some cases you do see practices which are they are presented as solidaric by the people who are performing them. But if you analyze them through an analytical notion of solidarity, you might then question, is this solidarity or is it not? So how do you go about making that distinction analytically and in practice?
And can I add a small thing? Because I started my humanitarian work in a solidarity movement. How can you avoid being so focused on solidarity with one group or one country or situation that you somehow lose some of the critical reflection that is required for all the times for solidarity to move on?
Well, I mean, solidarity is not a position, is it? I mean, it's an attribute, it's an aptitude, it's the way in which you understand the world and you see other people. So you're not locked into a solidaristic position where you're then excluding other groups. And of course, we're differently solidaristic in different moments, and Lily Chuluaki says, well, you know, a lot of what we learn about, what we see, invokes all kinds of different affects, forms of affect that you talked about, and where the solidarity comes is where you feel something but you act on the basis of that, and it's not just the feeling, and that's not enough. You know, that's the empathy and the sympathy, which is hugely problematic for all kinds of reasons that I think we've tried to show this morning. But it's about acting on that and doing something. And, you know, to go back to Hannah Arendt and Roger Silverstone, both of them, so Roger Silverstone talks about existential responsibility and Hannah Arendt talks about the doer and the sufferer as interchangeable. And I think that's what we haven't quite understood, is that actually we are all on the move in different ways. And so I think we're having the wrong conversation. I don't know why we're talking about refugees and migrants. I mean, why have we constituted this group? But there's groups of people who, for various reasons, are in a really horrendous, traumatic situation. And we've just got completely waylaid by, you know, what do we mean by refugee? What do we mean by migrant? I just think it's completely the wrong conversation.
I think thinking about how you would separate it analytically, it's also about, for the work that I've done with humanitarian workers and the interviews that we have done with humanitarian workers, I mean, humanitarian workers are just normal people, and it's a lot of professionalization. I mean, they're doing a job, and I think you need to separate what is the ideology of a particular organization, but also the individual motivations, and that's where I think it is very fascinating and very important to focus on what individual humanitarian workers do in a particular situation. Also because these humanitarian workers very often move from one side to another. This knowledge and the particular ways that people work is coming with them. We saw it very, very prominently, particularly in the beginning, in the Middle East crisis, when we interviewed people who had just worked in rural South Sudan, and suddenly they were dealing with Syrian refugees in urban Amman. And they brought the same issues with them, and had to negotiate themselves. So there's a lot of that sort of practical work that takes place in a particular situation that is part of shaping what humanitarian practice is. And with that comes particular forms of solidarity and particular forms of interaction with the different groups of people that they engage with. So I think you need to separate somehow in that sense.
But then, in a sense, you were saying that some of the humanitarians are getting so professional that they forget actually to interact with those that they should together find a solution for. Any further questions? We have one, please.
No.
There's one there as well.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
That's all right, I didn't see.
I'm Kathy Sutherland from Development Studies at University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and I was just thinking about the plenary yesterday where one of the speakers spoke about the disappointment of South Africa. And that's ringing quite strongly in my mind when I see this presentation, because in a way, in a country like South Africa, these processes that you're talking about are actually happening within the spaces of transformation in our country. And part of what I'm reflecting on in the way that you're speaking here is there's still a distance between the other. So it's another country, it's refugees coming from somewhere. But the processes that you're talking about, I'm thinking of the informal settlements we work in, these processes are happening in the everyday lived worlds of South Africa every single day. And in fact, the ways that people are negotiating, changing identities, working together, are kind of addressing a lot of the things that you're talking about. So I suppose I mostly wanted to challenge that idea yesterday of the disappointment of South Africa, and in fact ask people to look at the local spaces in South Africa and look at these engagements and the movement of people and how people on the ground are addressing that in multiple forms. And that maybe some of the answers, and I don't like the North-South divide either, but maybe some of the answers of trying to address these challenges in the so-called North are actually already sitting in the South, because that's what we work on every day. So it's certainly not a disappointment of South Africa, but a lot of very good change that's happening around the kinds of issues you're talking about. So maybe it's about an issue of scale, and maybe it's about distance and how we actually still see the other. Because in our society, the other is right next door to us. It's not that far away.
Thank you. I think we have one, that will be the final one. Oh, we have one more. So the two finalists, the gentleman at the back, and then you up here, please.
Yep, thanks. Asbjørn Løvbekk is the name. I would like to go back to Catherine's dichotomy in the beginning, humanitarianism 1.0, and then you had 2.0, 2.1. You sort of hinted that there is more to come. So is there a humanitarianism 3.0 as well? And to challenge you, I would say I would reject it. I would say that humanitarianism 2.0 is really humanitarianism 101, if you like. That should be the basis. Because if you want to have any impact on policy and on public opinion in Western countries, I think it's necessary to be a bit conservative, go back to the human rights, and legitimize your concerns in relationship to the fundamental principles of human rights, including anti-discrimination clauses. And it's only if you do that that you can get into a sensible discussion about what does it cost to help everybody. Because you can't help everybody immediately everywhere in the world. Now, the human rights discourse means that once you get into the literature on economic, social, and cultural rights, you will immediately be confronted with very rich literature on what does it cost to realize the different economic and social rights. And that's necessary if you want to go beyond just making moral statements on humanitarianism. Second point to Uma, this colonialism, apologize for the colonial past. It troubles me quite a bit because if it is not only an intellectual position, but also a position taken by governments, including the Indian one, you would have a number of governments around the world, more or less, not the most democratic ones, but authoritarian or autocratic regimes, who would stand up and applaud. Yes, everything that's wrong in our society is due to the colonial powers 50, 60, 70 years ago when we got our independence. So it doesn't make sense to pursue that one. But there is a clear distinction between the demand to say sorry to minorities within countries. And that's a different issue. And it should be pursued as a very different issues. And that's legitimate. I mean, you had it with indigenous peoples in many parts of the world. The demand that the state has to say, I'm sorry for the human rights abuses within our own country. But that's a different issue from this stupid apologize for colonialism, colonialism that ended 60, 70 years ago.
Thank you, Asbjørn. Very strong and critical questions to the two. But I wonder if we can take the last question as well, so then you can round up with all of it. Please.
Emma Maudsley from the University of Cambridge. Thank you for two incredibly inspirational talks. So it was really a comment partly responding to Kathy's observation, but also thinking about solidarities, about different geographies. And I was thinking that the Daily Mail's other great target, it's probably second to immigrants, is chavs and benefit scroungers and the poor. And I was thinking about those others in our own societies, like South Africa, and the way in which the Daily Mail seeks to dehumanize them, seeks to other them. And they're also the populations who very often bear the most immediate sort of effect of migrants and refugees being resettled in the very small numbers that Britain has shamefully taken. So, you know, there's a fascinating set of, I think, possibilities as well, and different solidarities generated by those dehumanized others in very different spaces and coming together and bringing, you know, getting away from that nasty north-south developmentalism and seeing, you know, different geographies of both othering and solidarity.
Thank you.
Can I just respond very quickly, because mine's going to be short. I wasn't suggesting at all about the apology. I mean, that was sort of, you know, it was a trite kind of response to a very wonderful question about reparations. So I wasn't suggesting that. What I was suggesting was that we can't just be future orientated, which is what we do in development, about goals and targets and sort of, you know, mid-year reports and all those kinds of things, that we need to look at past injustices to understand the ways in which people's agency is constituted and the context in which it takes place. So I wasn't suggesting that. And Emma, yes, thanks very much for that. I mean, what I didn't really get time to say very much about, but which I wanted to, and it relates to the comment about South Africa, is that you know, we've tried in the UK for years and years to sort of legislate for multiculturalism, to introduce policies. And of course, you don't build solidarity in that way, as both of you have said, the example from South Africa and Emma, your comment, that this happens at the level of convivial culture. This is in the everyday and the mundane rhythms of our lives. And so you can't legislate for that. And I was thinking about in the humanitarian context, is that the people who are the first on the scene is your neighbor. You know, it's only later that the professional appears and, as you say, then pushes out the local. And it's there that there's a different kind of solidarity and a conviviality that's taking place. But I think we don't see it because it only becomes a humanitarian event, and it only becomes humanitarianism when a particular body of groups of people arrive and do particular kinds of things.
And if I can add a small thing, it's often women who are first on the scene, but they are never seen or have contributed to any humanitarian disasters at all. Katrina.
Right, so the humanitarianism 1.1 or 2.0, I think for me, I called it 2.0 there is a distinction, I think, between humanitarianism with and without a sort of rights-based approach. And that's very important in the ethics behind the humanitarian principles. When you bring in rights, you bring in a kind of accountable governments, so you become much more involved in something that's slightly different from the original humanitarian principles, but today is very much part of the humanitarian discourse, I would say. Then I agree with you. I mean, I don't think a lot will change. I think 2.1 is very much to say that it's not like this is going to revolutionize the way that humanitarianism works. But even though I'm very critical to this sort of language of localization, and I really think, I don't know why did they call it the grand bargain? I think it's a terrible concept. But in the way, that language of localization, participation, it opens up something that I think by bringing in ethics of care is possible to move on in a particular direction. So it's a kind of opening, in a way, towards a perhaps more approach that could have more different types of humanitarianisms open in the discourse. And then I think an additional thing there is that I'm talking about the particular humanitarian space, as I call it, these different in-between humanitarian spaces, between rights and humanity in a way, in this particular case of protracted displacement. I think in other cases, rights might be much more important, for example, but we need to find a way of negotiating what is happening when people are stuck for an average of 26 years and how we deal with that and focus on that. So I think it's important that we differentiate between many different situations where the principles and the tools need to be used in different ways.
Thanks a lot, Katrine. I'm afraid we have to close. No, I think we have identified a number of pressing issues that we as academics and others who are going to take our advice really need to address. A big, big thanks to the two of you. A lot of thanks for the audience for the good questions and to Suneva.
And to Anna.
To all of you, a small present from the organizers. Katrina, thank you so much. Uma, thank you so much. And to the moderators as well. Arne.
Jag har två från förr, så det ska väl... Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
We will see each other again at the second plenary at 5 o'clock, the International Taxation Plenary in Dragefjella. Thank you.